So if the state may not have moral authority to exercise its coercive power over us because it lacks explicit consent from us, and if it lacks implicit consent from us, then what's there left? Some philosophers have suggested a kind of fair play justification for the state having the power that it does. Here the idea is we willingly take on a tremendous amount of benefits from the state, and as a matter of fairness, it's okay to take on certain burdens as well, namely the kind of coercive burdens that come with occupying a legal framework where we are required legally to behave in certain ways sometimes. Does this fair play argument pass muster? We're unfortunately not going to be able to spend much of our time looking at that issue. But I do want to again point to how substantive and fantastic and how interesting this question is. That is the general question of the justification of the state. Does it require consent, implicit or explicit? Does the idea that I freely and happily take on many of the benefits of living in a state, therefore give the state permission to behave coercively towards me, to burden me in this way because I freely accepted these things, where that acceptance doesn't count as consent? These are questions that we're going to have to leave for the moment. We're not quite done yet, though, because so far we've just been talking about the state, quite an abstract idea, and the consent to be governed by the state so that we don't end up tearing each other's throats out. Okay, but does any state work? I mean, can I consent to a monarchy? Can I consent to a theocracy? Would any kind of state be morally justified on these grounds? Well, the short answer is yes, if all that you're concerned with is the justification of the state's monopoly on coercive power, then lots of states could be justified in terms of providing more benefits than burdens in virtue of existing. We're not typically happy with that, though. We think the state needs to look a certain way. Specifically, most of the world these days recognizes the deep importance of the state being a democratic state. In other words, for it not just to be justified in terms of having a monopoly on coercive power in order to have us be able to exercise certain liberties that we wouldn't otherwise be able to exercise, but that the coercive power of the state be grounded on the will of the people, not be held by one family or one religion, but rather be grounded on what the people want. This is a really central ideal in modern times, namely the ideal of democratic states, democratic institutions. So here we're wedding the idea of state power, state legitimacy, with democratic legitimacy. The state is permitted to have coercive power, but that coercive power must be ultimately grounded on the will of the people. It's the people who decide what the legal and political institutions are. We will not be exploring in any depth the justification for democratic institutions, but we can point in the direction of how some thinking along these lines might go. The thought is simply this. We want the state to have the authority that it needs to have in order to set up the sort of institutions that will allow us to exercise our liberties. But we also recognize something, which is that with authority comes the risk of abuse of authority. This is very, very natural, and you can watch it play out in groups all the time. When you think about authority, you think about the idea of giving an individual or a group, an organization, a government, the power to do certain things that it otherwise wouldn't be permitted to do in order to provide a service for us. When thinking about the general idea of the state, the service that the state is providing is to create a kind of arena in which we can exercise our liberties to the best of our abilities. It's to create a kind of stable, peaceful environment for us to be able to enter into contracts with each other and pursue the life projects that we want to do. That's what we want the state to give us in return for us empowering it to create the sorts of institutions in which we can exercise our liberties freely. But we also recognize a truth about ourselves, and this is the other side of the fact this is the other side of the coin when it comes to thinking about human nature. When you give anything power, there is the risk of that power being abused. And so the thought for democracy is this, that the best way, the absolute best way to guarantee that power won't be abused is to disperse the legitimacy of that power across the will of the entire people, to put it in the entirety of the people's hands of who has power, and to put in the people's hands of the ability to remove people from power should they prove to be abusive in their use of that power. We can think about it another way. We want a state, so the argument goes, But we also don't want the state to become something ghastly unto itself. We don't want it to be the case that the state starts off making life better than it would be in the state of nature, but that ultimately becomes worse than the state of nature. And we recognize that power does have a corrupting influence. So the thought behind democracy is that when you end up creating a democratic state, when you end up creating a state that must be responsive to the will of the people, you greatly reduce the likelihood of the state ultimately becoming an abusive agent unto itself. You don't eliminate the possibility, and many people living in democracies are legitimately concerned with abuse of powers by the state. This is something that is always lurking in the background of any kind of power structure. All the same, the thought is that a democratic state, democratic institutions make it less likely than other kinds of institutions for the state to act abusively towards its citizens in its efforts to provide citizens with a state that, with a playing field that is better than the state of nature. So suppose we're on board with this idea that for the state to have moral authority, it can't merely be providing us with a better state of affairs than the state of nature would be providing us. That's maybe a first step, but that it must be a democratic state. It must, in some sense or other, ground its power, its legitimacy on the will of the people. If we're on board with this idea, the next question is, how does that get accomplished? And here's where ideas of transparency and accountability become so important when thinking about democratic states. Namely, the idea is the will of the people can only be exercised in holding the state accountable for its exercising of power if we know what the state is doing. This is why you see the public really being quite interested in accountability and transparency. Transparency is important because I can't hold anyone accountable for what they've done if I don't know what they've done. Accountability means that we must have mechanisms in place where I can get rid of people, or you can get rid of people, we collectively can get rid of people who are not doing the service that we've empowered them to do. So you want to create a democratic society where there are regular mechanisms in place for being able to remove people from power peacefully who are abusing that power or simply just doing a bad job. I mean, lots of people don't abuse power, they just aren't good at what we empowered them to do. We should have an ability to get rid of them and replace them with other people. And so we want mechanisms to be able to do that, but we also need transparency in order to know what's going on. Now, this question of transparency is a little bit thorny, because when we think about states like the United States of America, when we think about countries like that, we want its goings-on to be transparent to the public. We want to know what the country is doing on our behalf, especially when it comes to matters of security. We want to know what decisions are being made to keep us safe. But we also recognize that if our government were wholly transparent in all of its doings, then it would fail to be able to keep us safe. Sometimes government secrets do need to exist. Sometimes conversations do need to happen behind closed doors. Sometimes, if everything is immediately out in the open, the very thing we're trying to accomplish can't be accomplished. If President Obama, during the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where a lot of jokes are going back and forth, revealed that as he's talking, he's put plans in place to capture or kill Osama bin Laden, if he made that public at the time when that decision had been made, that would have undermined the very ability to accomplish the goal in place. This is obvious stuff for most of us. We recognize that sometimes government must act secretly if it's in fact to serve us towards the ends that we've empowered it to do, one of which is to keep us safe, another of which is to promote our freedoms. And so we recognize this real tension when it comes to freedom, security, and transparency. We want government to exist in order for us to act freely. We want to be more free with the state than we would be in the state of nature. We want to be able to pursue our life projects. We also want to be kept secure and safe, but we also recognize that there are some times when absolute transparency would undermine the goals that we've empowered the government to achieve on our behalf. And so there's never going to be a straight, clean answer as far as how much transparency, how much security, how much freedom. This is going to be a robust and rich debate in democratic societies.